Panic began to rise. I had my backpack ready, food and water packed, in case I needed to leave immediately. I considered fleeing into the forest, but the darkness and the unknown paths made it dangerous. I stayed inside, huddled near the fire, listening to every subtle noise, counting each scrape, each step that might be outside. Hours passed like this, until the first pale light of dawn began to filter through the windows. Exhausted, I slept in short bursts, never fully resting, my ears straining for any noise. When I woke fully in the morning, I found something more disturbing. The firewood I had stacked neatly the previous day was scattered across the clearing outside. Logs moved, rearranged. I checked the cabin walls for damage, scratches, marks, but there were none. Whoever had been here had been careful, watching, waiting. My logical mind told me to leave immediately, to drive the long dirt road back to the nearest town. But I was trapped by fear and uncertainty. The forest seemed alive with presence, unseen eyes watching me. I spent the next day fortifying the cabin as best I could. I moved furniture to block doors, reinforced the windows with extra logs and anything heavy I could find. Every time I stepped outside, I felt exposed, vulnerable. I tried to stay busy with chores, stacking firewood, cleaning, checking my supplies, but the tension never left. At night, the sounds came back, more distinct now. Footsteps in the dirt, branches scraping against walls, soft thuds on the roof. I stayed awake, waiting, trying to keep my breathing quiet, praying that whoever or whatever was out there would leave. On the third day, the presence escalated. Footprints circled the cabin repeatedly, leaving a clear ring around the structure. One side of the cabin had deep scratches, gouges in the wood, as if something had tried to break in but stopped. My fear turned into dread. I realized this was someone, not an animal. Someone had been watching, following me from the moment I arrived. I had no cell signal, no way to call for help, and the road back was treacherous and long. I needed a plan. I decided to leave at first light. I would pack everything, take only what I could carry, and head back along the road. I spent the night barricading the doors as best I could, then slept fitfully, nerves taut. When dawn arrived, I packed quickly, carrying my backpack, stove fuel, food, and water. I checked the clearing. Footprints had increased overnight, covering almost every step I had made outside. Someone had been circling the cabin while I slept, close enough to touch the windows. As I stepped onto the road, I noticed something. Fresh tire tracks in the dirt, leading into the woods but not following the path I had driven in on. Panic surged, but I forced myself to focus. I walked quickly along the road, backpack heavy, glancing constantly behind me. For hours, I kept moving, my legs burning, my chest tight, expecting to see someone emerge from the trees. Nothing appeared. Eventually, the tracks disappeared, the forest thickened, and the road turned back into the wider dirt trail I had driven on. I finally reached the first main road, flagged down a passing car, and drove straight to the nearest police station. The officers listened, checked the area from a safe distance, and confirmed that the cabin had been broken into in the past. Local reports suggested that squatters sometimes stayed for days, watching and waiting, taking care to remain unseen. I realized then that I had been incredibly lucky. My presence in the cabin had been detected by someone who might have been dangerous, but for reasons unknown, they never approached directly. I never returned to that cabin. Even months later, the memory of the isolation, the footsteps circling, and the quiet intensity of being watched stayed with me. I never underestimated the weight of silence again, and I understood that the forest, no matter how peaceful it seemed, could hide threats that were entirely human, entirely real, and entirely dangerous. Then I saw it, a small campsite, abandoned. The ground was flattened as if someone had slept there, a charred fire pit with ashes still warm to the touch, and a few scraps of food scattered around. No tent, no sign of who might have been there. I felt a flicker of unease. The place looked recent, very recent. My mind immediately went to all the warnings about people disappearing in forests, about campers encountering strangers who shouldn't have been there. I scanned the area carefully, my flashlight unnecessary in the bright morning sun, but my eyes darting instinctively. There was nothing, no movement, no figures hiding. I decided to return to my own sight quickly, my unease growing with every step. Back at my camp, I noticed something else. My firewood pile had been disturbed. Not much, just a few sticks out of place, but enough to make my stomach twist. I checked the tent, relieved to see nothing inside. Still, the thought lingered. I was not alone, and someone had been here while I was gone. My rational mind argued that it could have been an animal, but the earlier footprints and abandoned camp didn't fit that explanation. I decided to stay near the fire, keeping it going, and set up a basic trap around my perimeter. A small noise trap using empty cans tied with string, so I would be alerted if anything approached. The afternoon passed slowly, each snap or rustle of leaves sending adrenaline through me. I didn't eat much. I just sat and watched, fire between me and the surrounding forest. The sun began to set, and the shadows deepened. I started to hear noises again, soft at first, then unmistakably deliberate. The crunch of footsteps over dead leaves, careful but purposeful. My heart pounded. I gripped my knife, scanning the tree line with my flashlight. Then I heard a sound that made me freeze. The faintest whisper of fabric brushing against bark. Someone or something was moving through the forest, close enough that I could hear it clearly, yet still unseen. Panic was creeping in, but I forced myself to stay calm. I remembered the advice. Don't run blindly, keep the fire between you and the threat, and make your presence known if necessary. I decided to wait, silently watching the tree line. Hours passed. The footsteps never got closer, never left the shadows entirely. By the time the first light of dawn appeared, the forest had gone quiet again. No footprints near my tent, no disturbance in the firewood, just silence. I felt relief wash over me, but knew better than to lower my guard completely. I broke camp quickly that morning, my movements methodical but faster than usual. Every snap and rustle of the forest made me flinch. I packed everything, tied my tent, and hoisted my pack onto my shoulders. The path back to the trailhead felt different, longer somehow, every tree and boulder exaggerated in its scale. I kept scanning constantly, looking for movement, checking the tracks behind me. Hours passed. The forest was quiet now, the kind of quiet that presses against your ears and makes your heartbeat feel deafening. I finally saw the trailhead, the small sign marking the start of the trail, and felt a wave of relief that made my legs weak. Once I reached my car and locked the doors, I sat for a long while, breathing heavily, still scanning the trees from the safety of the vehicle. My hands shook as I drank water and tried to steady myself. The forest was behind me now, yet the memory of footsteps, the disturbed firewood, the abandoned campsite, everything stayed with me. I realized that I had been lucky. Whoever or whatever had been there had not intended a direct confrontation, but the threat had been real, tangible, and terrifying. I drove away slowly, still scanning the tree line, but eventually, the road curved and the forest became a distant shadow. I didn't look back after that. The experience stayed with me for weeks afterward, haunting my thoughts. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching, testing me, and that if I had made the wrong move, things could have ended very differently. In the end, I learned something important about the wilderness. It is beautiful, isolating, and freeing, but it is also unpredictable. It can hide danger in ways that aren't obvious, and even the most careful planning cannot guarantee safety. That day, I survived because of preparation, caution, and a steady head, and I carry the lesson with me whenever I return to the forest. Respect it, be aware, and never assume you are completely alone. I had always been drawn to the woods. There was something about the quiet, the smells, and the way sunlight scattered through the branches that made me feel alive. I planned this camping trip alone, wanting to escape the constant noise and obligations of city life. I packed carefully. A sturdy tent, a heavy-duty sleeping bag, extra blankets, a small stove, enough food for 4 days, water purification tablets, a flashlight, extra batteries, a first aid kit, and a hunting knife. I double-checked everything multiple times before I left, feeling the usual mix of excitement and nervousness that came with venturing into the wilderness by myself. The drive was long. I left the city just as the sun was rising, the air crisp and filled with the smell of wet pavement after a light drizzle. The closer I got to the forest, the quieter the world became. Cars were rare, and the roads narrowed, winding through thick stands of pine and birch. Birds called faintly in the distance, and the occasional squirrel darted across the road, its tiny claws clicking against the asphalt. I passed a few small cabins, empty and closed for the season, their windows shuttered, and smoke curling from chimneys that betrayed the presence of life in a few isolated spots. By mid-afternoon, I reached the parking area for the trailhead I planned to use. A small wooden sign indicated the start of a backcountry trail, one that promised isolation and the kind of solitude I craved. I grabbed my backpack and started hiking. The trail was narrow, covered with fallen leaves that rustled underfoot, and I noticed immediately that few people had passed this way recently. The forest was thick, trees spaced close together, their trunks wide and gnarled, some covered in moss. I could hear the sound of a distant creek, water moving over rocks, and occasionally a bird call echoed eerily through the dense woods. I hiked for several hours, climbing gradually higher into the hills. The trail became rougher, roots twisting across the path and rocks jutting unpredictably. I paused often to catch my breath, sip water, and take in my surroundings. There was a strange stillness that I hadn't noticed in more trafficked areas. The forest seemed to watch, every sound amplified in the absence of humans. Finally, I found a clearing that seemed perfect for my campsite. A flat area, slightly elevated, with a small stream nearby for water, and enough trees around to provide some cover and a windbreak. The sun was already low when I began setting up camp, the light filtering through the trees in thin, golden beams. I pitched the tent carefully, making sure the stakes were secure and the rain flap properly fastened. I gathered some dry wood for a fire, stacking it in a neat pile near a stone circle I built as a makeshift fire ring. I had brought matches and a lighter, but I also carried a small ferrocerium rod in case they failed. After some effort, the fire caught, the flames hissing as they consumed dry twigs and branches. The warmth was immediate, and the smell of burning would mingled with the forest's earthy aroma. I cooked a simple meal on my small stove, eating slowly as the sun dipped below the horizon and darkness crept into the woods. Night fell quickly. The forest transformed under the dim light of the moon, shadows stretching long and distorting familiar shapes. I cleaned up my cooking area, storing food securely in a bear-proof container and hanging it from a nearby tree branch as a precaution. I sat by the fire, enjoying the quiet, the occasional crackle of burning wood, and the distant sounds of animals moving through the underbrush. That's when I first noticed it, the sound of footsteps. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon moving carefully through the leaves. But as I listened, the pattern of the steps struck me as different. They were deliberate, heavier, and slower, the sound of boots or shoes pressing against the forest floor. I froze, straining to hear. The footsteps paused, then shifted direction slightly, keeping just out of the circle of firelight. My heart began to beat faster, a mix of fear and caution filling me. I was alone, deep in the forest, and something was moving around my camp. I picked up my flashlight and shone it toward the edge of the clearing, but all I could see were trees and darkness. I considered the possibility of a lost hiker or a hunter, but I hadn't seen anyone all day, and the nearest cabin was hours away. The footsteps resumed after a while, circling the clearing slowly, sometimes stopping, sometimes moving again. I could hear branches snapping lightly, leaves crunching under pressure, the sounds moving around me, always just beyond reach of the light. I tried to calm myself, telling myself it could be nothing, that the forest was full of wildlife and strange echoes. I checked my knife, gripping it tightly, and sat closer to the fire. I considered packing up and moving, but it was already late, and the thought of hiking in the dark without clear visibility was terrifying. So I stayed, tense and alert, listening to the footsteps continue in an irregular pattern around the clearing. Hours passed. I stayed awake most of the night, the fire dwindling to embers, adding wood carefully to maintain a small glow. The footsteps never stopped completely, though they occasionally moved away into the deeper forest. Every sound made me flinch: the rustle of leaves, the snapping of a branch, even the distant call of an owl felt like a threat. Couldn't sleep. The tension was exhausting, my mind constantly imagining worst-case scenarios. Someone with ill intentions, someone lost and panicked, or even a desperate hunter. I had planned this camping trip for months. It wasn't going to be anything fancy, just a few days in the middle of the forest, far enough from people to feel isolated, but not so far that I couldn't get out if something went wrong. I packed carefully, the way I always did, checking and double-checking my gear. A sturdy tent, a sleeping bag rated for cold nights, a small portable stove, enough food for 3 days, a first aid kit, extra batteries, and a flashlight. I even brought a small hand saw and a multi-tool, knowing the forest could throw anything at me. I told myself I was being cautious, but deep down, I knew I was eager for the solitude. I needed it. Life back in the city had become suffocating, a constant stream of noise and pressure, and the forest promised something different. A place where I could be completely alone and feel in control of my environment. I arrived at the trailhead late in the morning. The air was crisp, with a hint of smoke from distant campfires, and the sky was a pale, washed-out blue that promised no rain for at least a few days. The trail was narrow and mostly overgrown, not heavily traveled, and that was exactly what I wanted. I hoisted my backpack, feeling its weight settle on my shoulders, and began walking. The forest was dense, the kind of place where sunlight barely touches the ground. I passed under thick canopies of pine and fir, over gnarled roots that twisted across the path like sleeping snakes. Birds called out in distant bursts, and the occasional rustle in the underbrush hinted at deer or other small mammals going about their business. I walked steadily, making mental notes of landmarks: a fallen log, a sharp bend in the trail, a large boulder with moss growing in deep patches, so I wouldn't get lost on the way back. By late afternoon, I found a clearing that seemed perfect for setting up camp. It was flat, surrounded by a ring of tall trees that offered both privacy and protection from the wind. The ground was soft but firm, covered in a thick layer of fallen pine needles that smelled faintly of resin. I set my pack down and began to unpack my gear. Pitching the tent took longer than I anticipated because the ground, though soft, had hidden roots that made it difficult to drive the stakes deep. I finally got it secured and unrolled my sleeping bag inside, checking for rocks or anything that might make sleeping uncomfortable. After setting up, I gathered firewood, selecting dry branches and twigs that would catch quickly. By the time the fire was crackling, the sun had begun to dip, casting long, slanting shadows through the trees. I cooked a simple dinner on my portable stove, a can of beans heated with a few crackers, and ate slowly, listening to the forest around me. That was when I first noticed it, a smell that didn't belong. It was faint at first, like damp earth after rain, but with a sour, metallic edge. I paused, scanning the trees around the clearing, but saw nothing. Dismissing it as part of the forest, I finished my meal, cleaned up, and stoked the fire. Night was falling fast now, and with it came the quiet that only a deep forest can hold. The usual nocturnal sounds were there, crickets, distant owls, but beneath it was something else. An irregular snapping of branches, faint at first, then slightly closer. I froze, my stomach tightening. I reminded myself that I was alone in the wilderness and that animals often made strange noises. Still, there was something about the pattern of the snaps that felt deliberate, too calculated to be a deer or a raccoon. I grabbed my flashlight, shining it in the direction of the sounds. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating nothing but trees and underbrush. The snapping stopped. The rest of the night was tense. I kept the fire going as long as I could, using the light and warmth as a buffer against whatever might be out there. I arranged my multi-tool and small hand saw within reach, telling myself it was precaution, nothing more. Sleep finally claimed me only in short bursts, interrupted by my own imagination or the occasional sound that seemed just slightly wrong. The next morning, I woke early, sunlight filtering through the canopy, and decided to explore the area before it got too hot. I packed a small day bag with water, snacks, a knife, and a first aid kit, leaving the bulk of my gear in the tent. I wandered along a faint game trail, stepping over roots and rocks, my eyes scanning constantly. About an hour in, I noticed signs that someone or something had been there recently. There were footprints in the soft earth, not large, not obviously human at first glance, but too well-formed to be animal tracks. They led off in a direction deeper into the forest. My heart began to race, but curiosity, coupled with a strange sense of control, pushed me forward. I followed them for nearly half an hour, moving carefully, noting every bend and tree so I could find my way back. Then I saw it, a small campsite, abandoned. The ground was flattened as if someone had slept there. A charred fire pit with ashes still warm to the touch, and a few scraps of food scattered around. No tent, no sign of who might have been there. I felt a flicker of unease. The place looked recent, very recent. My mind immediately went to all the warnings about people disappearing in forests, about campers encountering strangers who shouldn't have been there. I scanned the area carefully, my flashlight unnecessary in the bright morning sun, but my eyes darting instinctively. There was nothing, no movement, no figures hiding. I decided to return to my own site quickly, my unease growing with every step. Back at my camp, I noticed something else. My firewood pile had been disturbed. Not much, just a few sticks out of place, but enough to make my stomach twist. I checked the tent, relieved to see nothing inside. Still, the thought lingered. I was not alone, and someone had been here while I was gone. My rational mind argued that it could have been an animal, but the earlier footprints and abandoned camp didn't fit that explanation. I decided to stay near the fire, keeping it going, and set up a basic trap around my perimeter. A small noise trap using empty cans tied with string, so I would be alerted if anything approached. The afternoon passed slowly, each snap or rustle of leaves sending adrenaline through me. I didn't eat much. I just sat and watched, fire between me and the surrounding forest. The sun began to set, and the shadows deepened. I started to hear noises again, soft at first, then unmistakably deliberate. The crunch of footsteps over dead leaves, careful but purposeful. My heart pounded. I gripped my knife, scanning the tree line with my flashlight. Then I heard a sound that made me freeze. The faintest whisper of fabric brushing against bark. Someone or something was moving through the forest, close enough that I could hear it clearly, yet still unseen. Panic was creeping in, but I forced myself to stay calm. I remembered the advice. Don't run blindly, keep the fire between you and the threat, and make your presence known if necessary. I decided to wait, silently watching the tree lean. Hours passed. The footsteps never got closer, never left the shadows entirely. By the time the first light of dawn appeared, the forest had gone quiet again. No footprints near my tent, no disturbance in the firewood, just silence. I felt relief wash over me, but knew better than to lower my guard completely. I broke camp quickly that morning, my movements methodical but faster than usual. Every snap and rustle of the forest made me flinch. I packed everything, tied my tent, and hoisted my pack onto my shoulders. The path back to the trailhead felt different, longer somehow, every tree and boulder exaggerated in its scale. I kept scanning constantly, looking for movement, checking the tracks behind me. Hours passed. The forest was quiet now, the kind of quiet that presses against your ears and makes your heartbeat feel deafening. I finally saw the trailhead, the small sign marking the start of the trail, and felt a wave of relief that made my legs weak. Once I reached my car and locked the doors, I sat for a long while, breathing heavily, still scanning the trees from the safety of the vehicle. My hands shook as I drank water and tried to steady myself. The forest was behind me now, yet the memory of footsteps, the disturbed firewood, the abandoned campsite, everything stayed with me. I realized that I had been lucky. Whoever or whatever had been there had not intended a direct confrontation, but the threat had been real, tangible, and terrifying. I drove away slowly, still scanning the tree line, but eventually, the road curved and the forest became a distant shadow. I didn't look back after that. The experience stayed with me for weeks afterward, haunting my thoughts. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching, testing me, and that if I had made the wrong move, things could have ended very differently. In the end, I learned something important about the wilderness. It is beautiful, isolating, and freeing, but it is also unpredictable. It can hide danger in ways that aren't obvious, and even the most careful planning cannot guarantee safety. That day, I survived because of preparation, caution, and a steady head, and I carry the lesson with me whenever I return to the forest. Respect it, be aware, and never assume you are completely alone. Morning came slowly, pale light seeping through the dense canopy. The footsteps had stopped during the night, leaving the forest eerily silent except for the natural sounds of birds and the stream. I felt a wave of relief mixed with exhaustion. I decided I needed to leave as soon as possible, even though part of me wanted to stay and finish the trip. I packed quickly, checking the area around the tent for signs of someone or something. There were faint tracks in the dirt, footprints that were not mine, leading away from the clearing. They were fresh and they gave me the chills. I started hiking back toward the trailhead, moving quickly but carefully. The forest seemed different in the morning light, less threatening but still tense. I kept my eyes on the trail, my ears alert for any unusual sounds. Hours passed as I descended the hills, my legs burning from the climb down, my mind replaying the events of the previous night. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been watched, that someone had been close enough to touch the tent if they had wanted to. Finally, I reached the parking area. The relief was overwhelming. I was back in a place where I could see cars, paths, and the remnants of human activity. My phone had weak signal, but enough to call a friend and tell them I was safe. I realized how close I had been to real danger, how isolated and vulnerable I had been in those woods. The police advised me to report the footprints and the strange circumstances, so I gave them a detailed account of what I had experienced. They said it could have been someone passing through, possibly a hunter or another camper, but no reports matched my description exactly. Even though I had escaped without physical harm, the experience changed me. I learned to respect the isolation of nature in a new way, to prepare not just for natural dangers but for unpredictable human threats as well. I reviewed my gear, updated my first aid kit, and added extra precautions for future trips, including pepper spray, a stronger flashlight, and a whistle to signal for help. Weeks later, I returned to the same area during daylight, carefully walking the trail and examining the clearing where I had camped. There were remnants of footprints, the flattened area where my tent had stood, and signs of someone else's campfire, long extinguished. It was clear I had not imagined the experience. I felt a strange mix of fear and fascination, knowing the forest had its secrets and that I had been lucky to leave unharmed. The experience taught me to trust my instincts, to take even minor sounds seriously, and to respect the unpredictable nature of isolation. It also gave me a strange sense of accomplishment, surviving a terrifying situation alone, relying solely on preparation, caution, and alertness. I never camped in that specific clearing again, but I continued exploring the wilderness, always carrying the lessons from that night. I knew now that fear could be a survival tool, and preparation and awareness could make the difference between danger and safety. In the end, the woods had not defeated me, but they had changed me. I walked away with a deeper understanding of solitude, vigilance, and respect for the unknown. Every time I return to nature, I remember that night. The feeling of footsteps circling my camp, the tension, the silence, and the relief of daylight, and I carry it as both a warning and a lesson in staying alive, aware, and prepared. I had always loved the idea of escaping into the wilderness, far away from city noise and the endless buzz of screens. The plan was simple: one solo camping trip in a remote forest region, where I could just be alone with nature for a few days. I had picked a place after weeks of research, a national forest several hours' drive from the nearest town. It wasn't a well-known camping area, just a few rugged trails and scattered clearings. I had the map, compass, and a fully stocked backpack. I thought I was prepared for anything. Looking back, I realize now how naive that was. The first day of the hike was normal enough. I left the trailhead around mid-morning, carrying a pack that was heavier than I liked, but manageable. The air was crisp, with the smell of pine needles and damp earth. I moved steadily along the narrow trail, listening to the birds and the occasional rustle of small animals in the underbrush. Around midday, I reached a small clearing by a creek. It was the kind of spot that felt untouched, almost like it existed outside of time. I took off my pack and sat by the water, letting the cold water run over my hands. I filled my water bottles, ate some trail mix, and rested. As the afternoon wore on, I continued deeper into the forest. The trail became less distinct, and I had to rely more on the map and compass. The forest thickened, with old trees creating a dense canopy overhead. The sunlight barely reached the ground, giving the area a dim, shadowy feel even during the day. By late afternoon, I found a potential campsite near a small hill that overlooked a shallow valley. The ground was level, clear of rocks and debris, and I could see a few fallen logs I could use for sitting. I started setting up my tent, careful to stake it securely in the soft soil. Once the tent was up, I collected firewood. The forest was quiet, the kind of quiet that made me acutely aware of every little sound. Twigs snapped underfoot, leaves rustled in the wind, and somewhere in the distance, a bird called out sharply. I started a small fire, the smoke curling into the canopy above. I prepared a simple dinner, freeze-dried pasta that I heated over the fire, and ate slowly, appreciating the solitude. As night began to fall, the forest changed. The shadows deepened, and the air grew colder. My fire was the only source of light in the gathering darkness. That's when I noticed it. At first, it was just a sound, a low, dragging noise coming from somewhere beyond the edge of the clearing. I froze and listened, trying to locate it. The sound was slow and deliberate, a kind of scraping, shuffling movement that carried through the cold night air. My first thought was an animal, maybe a deer or a bear, but there was something about the rhythm that didn't feel right. It was heavy, like something large was moving over uneven ground. I went inside my tent, zipping it shut but leaving a small mesh window open to keep the air flowing. I tried to calm myself, telling myself that bears and wild animals were usually more cautious around humans, that I was probably just hearing the wind and my imagination mixing together. But the sound didn't stop. It circled my camp, sometimes close, sometimes further away. I could hear the crunch of leaves, the snap of small branches, and occasionally, a thump that made my stomach twist. I remembered the survival advice I had read. Stay calm, stay put, make yourself visible, and don't provoke the animal. I kept the fire burning, adding sticks to make it brighter and hotter. I tried to sleep, but the noise was relentless. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined something huge looming over the tent, or worse, that it was a person. Someone lost or dangerous in the forest, wandering near my camp. My mind raced with every possible scenario, none of them comforting. By midnight, the sounds had shifted. They were closer, moving with purpose. I peeked through the mesh window and saw a shadow moving along the edge of the clearing. My heart pounded. I couldn't make out details, but the size was larger than any deer I had ever seen. Then I heard a low growl, unmistakably from a bear. I had my bear spray, but it was at the bottom of my pack. Panic surged. I remembered reading that sudden movements could provoke a bear. I stayed as still as possible, holding my breath, watching the firelight flicker over the underbrush. The bear circled my fire, sniffing the air, grunting occasionally. Seemed aware of me, aware of the fire, but it didn't leave. I realized that my location might have been too close to a natural food source. Berries and small animals were abundant in the area, and my campsite was near the creek. I had to act, but I had to act carefully. Slowly, I reached for my pack, inch by inch, keeping my eyes on the shadow outside. My hand finally closed around the bear spray. I waited, tense, listening to the bear moving around the perimeter of my campsite. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, the bear moved away. I could hear it breaking branches and shuffling further down the slope. I didn't move. I just stayed in the tent, heart hammering, until the sounds faded into the distance. The night was far from over, but at least the immediate danger had passed. I stayed awake for hours, too scared to sleep fully, listening to every rustle, every distant sound. When morning finally arrived, the light filtering through the canopy felt like a relief, almost a reward. I emerged cautiously from the tent, scanning the area. The bear tracks were all around my campsite, some very close to where I had slept. I realized just how lucky I had been. The rest of the day was spent packing up quickly and moving to a different site farther from the creek. I decided to stay in a more open area, where I could see in all directions. I avoided areas with heavy underbrush or potential bear hiding spots. I continued to hear wildlife, but nothing like the night before. The fear lingered, a heavy weight that made every movement deliberate and cautious. I kept my food stored in bear-proof containers, hung from a tree, and made sure my fire was constantly monitored. Over the next 2 days, I continued exploring, always alert, always scanning the forest. I saw deer, squirrels, and birds, but no sign of another bear. I maintained a strict routine, checking my surroundings before moving, making noise as I walked to avoid surprising any animals, and always keeping my spray and knife within reach. By the last night, I felt more confident, but the experience had left me wary, aware that the forest was not just beautiful. It was dangerous and unpredictable. When it came time to leave, I packed everything carefully, leaving no trace behind. The hike back to the trailhead was long, but uneventful. I kept replaying the night with the bear in my mind, the adrenaline, the fear, and the stark realization of how small and vulnerable I was in that environment. It had been terrifying, but I had survived by staying calm, prepared, and aware. Back at my car, I sat for a long time, exhausted but relieved. I had made it. The forest had tested me in ways I hadn't anticipated, but I had learned a valuable lesson about respect for nature, preparation, and vigilance. I drove home slowly, savoring the warmth of the car and the safety of civilization. The trip had been a stark reminder that the wilderness is unforgiving and that even simple mistakes or miscalculations can have serious consequences. I felt grateful, lucky, and more cautious than ever before. The fear would fade over time, but the memory of that night would stay with me forever. A sharp, clear reminder of the thin line between awe and danger. The story didn't end with horror or injury, it ended with survival. Every step I took, every decision I made had mattered. I learned to read the forest in a way I never had before, to anticipate, to respect, and to act deliberately. When I finally shared the story with friends, I didn't dramatize it. I told it as it happened. A terrifying, close encounter with nature that I survived because of preparation, caution, and luck. And every time I think back, I remember the smell of wet pine needles, the crackle of the fire in the dark, and the low, deliberate sound of something massive moving just beyond the circle of light, reminding me that the forest always holds its secrets, and sometimes it tests you just to see if you're ready. I had always liked the idea of camping alone. There was a sense of freedom in packing a small backpack, heading deep into the forest, and being completely on my own. I told myself it was about disconnecting from the constant noise of life, the city, and people. I liked the quiet. I liked the way nature forced you to rely on yourself. This trip was supposed to be no different, except I had picked a more isolated spot this time. A trail I had heard about but never explored, deep in the northern woods, where maps barely marked anything more than vague lines and rivers. I packed carefully, as I always did. A tent, sleeping bag, stove, extra food, water, fire-starting kit, a flashlight, a headlamp, extra batteries, a first aid kit, and my small survival knife. I checked everything 3 times. I had been camping before, but I had never gone this far from civilization. I started hiking in the early morning, the air crisp and heavy with the smell of wet earth. The trail began wide and familiar but soon narrowed, overgrown with grass and low branches. The further I went, the quieter it got. Birdsong faded into distant rustling in the trees, and after a few hours, it was just me and the sound of my own breathing. I moved carefully, sometimes stepping over fallen logs, sometimes pushing past dense shrubs. Sunlight filtered through the leaves in thin, pale streaks. Felt remote, even untouched. I liked it. By late afternoon, I reached a small clearing beside a slow-moving stream. I decided this would be my campsite. I picked the flattest ground I could find, away from the stream but close enough to hear water if I fell asleep. I set up my tent, making sure the stakes were firm, the rainfly tight. Then I gathered some dry wood nearby. It wasn't perfect. Much of it was damp from earlier rain, but I had enough to start a fire. I stacked small kindling under a few larger logs and prepared my stove in case I needed it. The forest was quiet around me. Birds were gone, and the occasional distant sound of a branch snapping under a deer's hoof echoed in the hollow silence. Night came fast. By the time I lit my fire, it was nearly dark. The flames crackled and threw flickering shadows on the tent walls. I ate a simple dinner. Canned beans heated over the stove with a small piece of bread. Felt peaceful. The air was cooling quickly, and I added more wood to the fire to keep warm. After eating, I cleaned up my area meticulously, making sure there were no food scraps that could attract animals. I had always been cautious, but this time I felt an edge, a small niggling feeling that something wasn't right. I tried to ignore it. Around midnight, I woke to a sound. A low, persistent rustling somewhere just beyond the firelight. At first, I thought it was a deer or some other small animal. I stayed very still, listening. The sound moved closer. My pulse quickened. I had packed bear spray, but I hadn't wanted to think about using it. My mind raced through possibilities. A bear? A mountain lion? Maybe even a wild dog. Whatever it was big. The rustling didn't sound like the nervous scampering of a small animal. This was deliberate, heavy. I didn't dare leave the tent, so I stayed inside, watching the fire. Every few seconds, I could hear the sound shift from one side of the clearing to the other, circling. My hands shook slightly as I gripped my knife. I whispered to myself to stay calm, but every shadow outside seemed to stretch and move unnaturally. Hours passed. I could hear heavy breathing, or maybe it was mine, echoing in the night. At one point, a branch snapped close enough that it made me flinch violently. My fire had burned low, so I used my headlamp to check around my tent. There was nothing visible, just trees and brush, but the rustling never stopped. I felt trapped, unable to sleep, unable to do anything but watch. Every sound seemed magnified. Leaves falling, small twigs snapping under unknown weight. I tried to rationalize it, telling myself it was just a deer or a raccoon, but deep down I knew something was wrong. Morning finally came, though I had not slept. The sun broke through in thin strips, casting long shadows across the clearing. I packed my fire carefully and tried to move quietly, hoping that whatever had been out there would not notice me leaving. As I walked, I scanned constantly. I didn't see any footprints that could have belonged to a person, but the ground was soft in places, leaving room for mistakes. Still, I felt eyes on me. The feeling stayed with me for the entire hike back to the main trail. I was lucky to reach the main path before noon. There were occasional hikers now, people with dogs and kids, chatting and laughing, reminding me of how isolated I had been. I tried to shake off the lingering unease, but I couldn't stop thinking about the previous night. My mind kept circling back to that sound, that presence. There had been no humans around, no evidence of them, yet something had been there. I stopped by a stream to refill my water bottle and take a short break. While crouching, I noticed something unusual in the dirt along the bank. Footprints, but not human. Large, rounded, with deep impressions, claw marks visible at the toes. I froze. They were fresh, maybe from the night before. My stomach sank. I realized then that the rustling, the circling I had heard, had been a large predator, most likely a bear, maybe a mother bear with cubs. I hadn't seen it, but I had felt it, and I had been lucky. If it had been a bear searching for food near my tent, it could have been much worse. My hands shook, but I felt grateful. I decided to shorten my trip. I still wanted the experience of being alone, but I understood now the risk of being this deep without more protection. I took careful steps back along the trail, watching for movement, listening for snapping twigs. Every time I heard rustling, I froze, ready to react. It took hours, But eventually, I reached the parking lot. The sound of cars, voices, and civilization felt almost jarring after the deep silence of the forest. I exhaled and sat on a bench for a long time, trying to calm myself. On the drive home, I thought about the trip over and over. I realized that even when you prepare perfectly, even when you think you understand nature, it is still unpredictable. That night had reminded me that the wilderness is not forgiving. A simple mistake, an ill-timed noise, or the wrong place at the wrong time can change everything. Once home, I unpacked my gear, checking everything again. The knife, the stove, the fire-starting kit. I wanted to see that nothing had been damaged, that I had brought everything back safely. I felt a strange sense of pride mixed with lingering fear. I had survived a real threat, not some story or imagined ghost, but a tangible, living danger. I made notes in my journal about the area, the trail conditions, the wildlife, and what I would do differently next time. I resolved to return one day, but I knew it would be with more preparation, perhaps a companion, and a renewed respect for the power of the forest. The memory of that night stayed with me for months. I would think of the fire, the shadows, the rustling, and I would feel the same pulse of fear I had felt then. But it also reminded me why I liked camping. It forced me to focus, to be aware, to feel alive in a way nothing else could. And despite the fear, despite the danger, I knew I had survived because of careful preparation, calm thinking, and respect for the wild. The lesson stayed with me. The forest is not a storybook. It does not forgive carelessness. But if you respect it, if you pay attention, if you prepare and think ahead, you can emerge not only unharmed but stronger, wiser, and more alive. That trip, frightening as it had been, had taught me more than I could have imagined. And every time I returned to nature afterward, I carried that memory, that careful awareness, ensuring I never underestimated the quiet, patient power of the wilderness again. The sun was just slipping below the horizon when I finally reached the small clearing I had chosen for the night. I had been hiking all day, following a rough trail through dense woods that twisted like veins over the hills. My pack was heavy with the bare essentials: a tent, sleeping bag, stove, a few cans of food, water, a first aid kit, and my flashlight. I had been looking forward to this solo camping trip for months. A chance to disconnect from everything and just be alone in the forest. The sky was a soft orange fading to dark blue, and the first stars were beginning to appear. I felt a rare kind of peace, even as the chill of evening settled over the trees. I set up my tent on a flat patch of ground, careful to avoid the thicker brush and any obvious animal trails. Once it was upright, I cleared a small area for a fire pit, surrounding it with rocks I had gathered. I stacked some dry branches and twigs nearby, all the while keeping a careful eye on the trees. Even though the forest was quiet, there was always a feeling of being watched, as though the shadows themselves were waiting. I shrugged the feeling off. It was just my mind playing tricks, I told myself. I wasn't afraid, just alert. By the time I finished setting up, it was dark. The forest had transformed completely. Shapes that had seemed harmless in daylight now loomed like silent figures in the firelight. I started a small fire, the crackle of the flames filling the still air, and began cooking a simple meal of beans and rice. The smell was comforting, familiar, and for a moment I allowed myself to relax. The sounds of the forest were layered around me. The rustle of leaves in the breeze, the distant hoot of an owl, and the occasional snapping of a twig underfoot, which I assumed was a deer or some small animal. Everything felt normal, or at least normal enough to convince myself it was. After eating, I leaned back against a tree and watched the fire, letting my mind wander. The woods, so alive with sound earlier, seemed quieter now, almost unnaturally so. The wind had died down, and the usual chorus of nighttime creatures had dwindled to an occasional distant rustle. It was too quiet. My stomach twisted into a knot. I knew this feeling. I had been in forests before, alone, and I knew that a sudden drop in sound was rarely a good sign. I glanced around the clearing, flashlight in hand, trying to spot any movement. The beam caught nothing but trees, and I shook my head. I was being paranoid. Maybe I was just letting the stories I had read get to me, the ones about people getting lost or worse, attacked by wildlife. But even as I convinced myself of that, my senses felt stretched, every crack of a branch or snap of a twig jarring. My hands tightened around the flashlight. I didn't want to admit it, but the feeling of unease was growing. Then I heard it, a low, heavy thump. It wasn't like the light snapping of a branch. This was deliberate, like someone or something was stepping heavily nearby. My heart hammered in my chest. I froze, straining my ears. There it was again, the thump, closer this time. I swept the flashlight across the trees. Shadows danced across the trunks, long and strange. I didn't see anything, but the sound persisted. Thump, thump. It was coming from just beyond the clearing. I swallowed, trying to keep my breathing steady, but my hands shook. I reminded myself that bears were common in this area. Bears moved like that, large, heavy, deliberate. And while a bear could be dangerous, it was better to know what you were dealing with. I unzipped my tent slightly, ready to grab my small hatchet if needed, and shined my light in the direction of the noise. Nothing, but the thumping continued. Every step sounded closer, crunching over the dry leaves. My stomach twisted again, but I forced myself to stay still, trying to observe. Suddenly, a loud snap rang out, much closer this time. My flashlight caught a shadow moving fast behind a tree. My first thought was bear. My second thought was to remain calm. I had read that sudden movements could provoke an animal. I didn't move, my muscles tight, every nerve alert. The forest seemed to hold its breath with me. Another snap, then silence. I could hear the thumping moving around the clearing now. It circled, stopping and starting, moving unpredictably. Whatever it was testing me. I realized my fire wasn't enough to keep it at bay. I glanced at my pack and spotted my small canister of bear spray. I wasn't thrilled about the idea of using it, but my stomach told me I might need it. I kept my flashlight trained on the perimeter of the clearing, scanning slowly, trying to catch a glimpse. Then I saw it. A massive shape slipping between the trees, its outline barely visible in the dim light. It was large, much larger than a deer, and moved with a terrifying grace. My breath caught. I backed toward my tent, keeping my eyes fixed on the shape. As I did, it stepped out of the shadows and froze. I could make out a massive head, small ears, and sharp claws. A bear, I realized, but something wasn't right. Bears usually avoided humans, and this one was different. It was curious, almost predatory. I slowly reached for the bear spray, careful not to make sudden movements. My mind raced through everything I had read about bear encounters. Stay calm, don't run, make yourself appear large, and speak softly. But my mouth was dry, and I couldn't even form words. The bear took a step closer, sniffing the air, and then another. I could hear the heavy thumping of its paws as it approached the firelight. My heart pounded, each beat loud in my ears. I realized that my fire might be the only thing keeping it hesitant. I grabbed a handful of branches and threw them into the fire, sending a flare of sparks into the air. The bear recoiled slightly, giving me a momentary sense of control. I backed slowly toward my tent, keeping the light on the bear, hoping it wouldn't charge. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the flashlight steady. I could feel the sweat running down my back, soaking the fabric of my shirt. The bear circled, sniffing, watching, and then, for a horrifying moment, it charged. I froze. Time seemed to stretch. I could see its muscles rippling under its fur, its teeth bared. I remembered the bear spray. I shoved the nozzle toward its face and pressed. A strong mist shot into the air just as the bear skidded to a halt, sneezing and snapping. It backed off, growling and shaking its massive head. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed a large stick and banged it against a rock, making as much noise as I could. The bear, confused and irritated, finally turned and disappeared into the trees. I stayed frozen for several minutes, too afraid to move, listening to the forest resume its usual sounds. The occasional rustle and distant calls of birds replaced the thumping I had heard earlier. My chest ached from adrenaline, my hands trembling, but I realized I was still alive. Slowly, I extinguished most of the fire, leaving a small ember to maintain light, and crawled into my tent. My sleeping bag was soaked with sweat, and I lay awake, heart still racing, listening to the quiet forest. I knew the bear could return, but it hadn't. Eventually, exhaustion overtook fear, and I slept lightly, waking several times to scan the perimeter with my flashlight. Morning came, pale and gray. The forest looked different in daylight, less threatening, more neutral. I packed my gear quickly, scanning for tracks. There were massive paw prints circling the clearing, confirming the previous night's encounter. I felt a mixture of relief and awe. The bear had tested me, but I had survived without injury. I hiked back down the trail, constantly alert, every sound amplified by the memory of last night. By the time I reached the car, I was exhausted but alive, grateful for the experience, and oddly exhilarated. I realized that nature was beautiful, but it was also dangerous and unpredictable. You had to respect it, be prepared, and understand that survival often depended on keeping calm and thinking clearly. That day, I learned more about myself than I ever expected. I had faced fear alone in the wilderness and had come through it alive, carrying the memory of a night I would never forget. And as I drove away, I knew I would return to the woods, but never again unprepared, and never underestimating the raw power of the wild. I had always loved camping, the way the forest smelled after rain, the sound of leaves shifting in the wind, the quiet that made every small noise seem amplified. That summer, I decided to take a solo trip to a remote part of the national forest I had never visited before. I wanted a challenge, a chance to disconnect from everything, to be truly alone. I packed my backpack with all the essentials I could think of: tent, sleeping bag, water filters, extra food, a first aid kit, a small stove, a map, and a compass. I even brought a hatchet and a folding saw, thinking ahead in case I needed firewood. I started my hike early in the morning, the sun still low on the horizon. The trailhead was quiet, with only a few parked cars, and the air was crisp. I felt a thrill of excitement as I stepped onto the dirt path that led into the thick forest. First, the hike was easy. The trail was clearly marked, and I moved at a steady pace, enjoying the chirping birds and the distant rustle of squirrels in the underbrush. I passed a small creek about 2 miles in, stopping to drink some water and refill my bottle after filtering it. The forest around me was dense, the trees tall and close together, and I began to feel a strange kind of isolation. Not dangerous, but noticeable. My steps were muffled by the thick layer of fallen leaves and pine needles on the ground. By late afternoon, I reached a clearing I had marked on my map as a potential campsite. It was perfect. Flat ground, a few large rocks, and a circle of trees that would block most of the wind. I set up my tent slowly, making sure it was secure. I gathered wood and built a small fire pit, careful to keep it contained. By the time the sun began to dip, the forest was quiet in a way that made my ears ring. I cooked a simple meal of rice and canned beans over the fire, savoring the warmth and the solitude. As night fell, I lay in my tent, listening to the forest around me. The sounds were normal at first. The wind in the trees, distant owls, the occasional scurrying of small animals. But after a while, I started noticing other sounds, small, irregular noises that seemed closer than they should be. Branches snapping underfoot, twigs breaking, a low rustling that didn't seem to belong to any of the usual wildlife. At first, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a deer or a raccoon or even a fox. But the noises kept happening, and the timing was strange. They weren't constant, but they seemed to circle the campsite. I decided to step out and check. I had my flashlight and a small knife just in case. The forest outside my tent was dark, almost pitch black beyond the reach of the flashlight beam. I scanned the area, but there was nothing, just trees and shadows. The noises had stopped. I felt a small relief but also a creeping unease. I went back into my tent, zipped it up, and tried to sleep. My mind kept imagining movements just beyond the edge of the light. Every few minutes, I heard a snap, a rustle, or the soft crunch of leaves, and my heart would jump. Around midnight, I woke to a louder sound, like someone or something moving deliberately through the brush. It was close, unmistakable. My first instinct was to grab my hatchet, but I froze. Whoever or whatever it was, I couldn't see it. The sound circled the tent, slow and careful, like someone was watching. I realized I hadn't locked the tent's flap completely, and the thought of an animal or a human intruder entering made my stomach turn. I sat still, trying to calm my breathing, listening. The noise moved away gradually, but I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. By morning, I was exhausted. I had to make a decision. I considered staying, but my instincts told me that there was a real possibility of someone else being nearby, watching, or following the trail I had taken. I packed my things carefully, checking that I had everything. The forest in daylight seemed less threatening, but I kept my senses sharp. I had to plan my route out, and I wanted to avoid the main trails in case whoever or whatever had been circling was still around. I decided to head downstream, following the small creek I had passed the day before. It would give me water and a natural guide, and it was far enough from the trail to avoid encounters. The forest along the creek was thick and progress was slow. My boots sank into mud, and the underbrush scratched at my arms. I had to cross small sections of the stream, balancing carefully on slippery rocks. Every sound made me tense. A fish jumping, a branch falling, a bird taking off. I was hyper-aware of everything. Around mid-morning, I noticed something that made my heart pound. Fresh footprints in the mud, too large and heavy to be deer, leading in the same direction as I was heading. Human footprints. They weren't clear enough to identify the shoe type, but they were deep, as if whoever had made them was carrying something heavy or was a large person. I felt a cold wave of fear. Whoever had been circling my campsite the night before was still nearby, and they were on the same path I was taking. I debated my options. I could try to leave the forest entirely and risk running into them, or I could continue following the creek, hoping to put distance between us. I chose the creek. At least it gave me water and a natural escape route. I moved quickly but quietly, listening constantly. I found myself stepping over roots and stones, trying not to slip. My heart was racing, but I tried to focus on practical survival. I had a knife, a small first aid kit, and a limited supply of food. I had to stay calm. Hours passed, and I saw no sign of the person following me, but I knew they were there. I could feel it. My exhaustion made every step harder. I rested briefly under a large pine tree, drinking water and eating a few bites of food. I noticed other signs, broken branches, areas where the underbrush had been disturbed recently. Whoever had been following me was skilled at moving quietly and leaving little trace, but the forest left subtle hints. After that trip, I realized how dangerous solo camping in remote areas could be. It wasn't ghosts or fairy tales that posed the real risk. It was other people, animals, and the environment itself. I had learned the importance of preparation, awareness, and trusting instincts. The forest was beautiful and wild, but it demanded respect and caution. I left that area with a renewed sense of vigilance and gratitude, knowing I had survived a real, tangible threat because I had stayed calm, thought clearly, and relied on practical skills. I still camp, but never alone in such remote areas. I now always tell someone my route, carry extra communication tools, and pay close attention to subtle signs around me. That experience stayed with me, a reminder that danger can come in quiet, subtle ways, and that preparation and awareness can make all the difference. I had been planning this camping trip for months. I had taken the time to research a remote area in the mountains, far away from the usual trails and crowded campgrounds. The idea was to find complete solitude, to spend a week alone in the wilderness with nothing but a small tent, a backpack full of essentials, and a fire starter. I wanted to escape, to disconnect from the constant noise of the city, the phones, the work, and the traffic. I imagined sitting by a fire at night, staring at the stars, hearing only the wind in the trees and the distant calls of birds and animals. It sounded perfect, I packed my backpack carefully, double-checking my supplies: water, a portable stove, canned food, a sleeping bag rated for low temperatures, a first aid kit, extra clothes, a flashlight, and a small pocket knife. I also brought a map and a compass, though I knew GPS might work in some areas. I left my car at the trailhead early in the morning, before sunrise, wanting to reach the remote spot while the light was still soft and quiet. The hike started easy enough. The trail was narrow but well-marked at first. I had expected rugged terrain, but the path seemed manageable. The air was crisp, and I could hear the occasional rustle of wildlife. Birds flitted through the trees, and I even saw a deer in the distance, pausing to watch me before moving silently into the woods. The further I went, the quieter everything became. The sounds of the road and civilization faded completely. I noticed the change in temperature as the sun rose higher. It became warmer than I expected, and I stopped occasionally to remove layers, adjusting my pack straps, sipping water, and checking my map. By noon, I had hiked several miles, crossing a small stream on stepping stones. The water was icy cold, and I felt the need to refill my bottle, but I remembered I would have to boil it before drinking. I found a flat spot near the stream, took off my pack, and rested for a while. I ate a simple lunch, a couple of energy bars and a can of beans. I was careful to keep my trash packed securely, knowing that bears and other animals could be a problem if they smelled food. After the rest, I continued hiking. The trail grew steeper, winding upward through rocky terrain. My legs burned from the exertion, and I paused several times to catch my breath. I noticed that some of the trail markers were faded, and in places, fallen trees had blocked the path. I had to climb over them, careful not to twist an ankle. As I hiked higher, the trees thinned out, revealing jagged rocks and patches of wildflowers. The sun was still bright, but I could see shadows lengthening as afternoon approached. I found a small plateau with a flat area suitable for camping. It was surrounded by rocks that formed a natural barrier on three sides, and it overlooked a valley below. The view was incredible. I set my pack down and began searching for a suitable spot to pitch my tent. I cleared the area of rocks and branches, making sure it was flat enough for sleeping. The ground was hard but manageable. I checked for any signs of animals or insect nests, finding none. I finally set up the tent, securing it firmly with stakes into the rocky soil. By late afternoon, my campsite was ready. I took off my boots, stretched my legs, and felt a sense of relief. I had earned this spot. It was isolated, quiet, and breathtakingly beautiful. I built a small fire pit using stones I found nearby. I arranged dry twigs, small branches, and pine needles, making sure I had enough for the night. I used my fire starter to light the fire, carefully nurturing it until it became steady. The warmth of the flames was comforting, and I spent time watching the smoke curl into the sky, thinking about the solitude I had been craving. As the sun dipped lower, the shadows grew long and the air turned cooler. I cooked a simple dinner over the fire, canned beans mixed with rice and a bit of seasoning from my backpack. The smell was satisfying, and I felt proud of managing this little bit of independence in the wilderness. I cleaned my dishes carefully, packing all trash in a plastic bag and placing it in my backpack. I knew that leaving anything behind could attract animals. By the time night fully descended, the sky was a deep indigo, speckled with stars. The moon was thin but bright, casting pale light over the rocks. It was then that I first noticed the noises. At first, it was subtle, rustling sounds coming from the trees and rocks nearby. I told myself it was just animals, maybe deer or a fox moving around. The sounds were soft but persistent. I felt uneasy, though I tried to dismiss it. I checked my surroundings with my flashlight, scanning the area carefully. Nothing seemed out of place, and the rocks formed a partial barrier, making it hard for larger animals to approach unnoticed. I tried to focus on my fire, the warmth and crackling flames comforting me. But as the night deepened, the noises grew louder, more deliberate. It was no longer random rustling. It sounded like something was moving through the underbrush, breaking twigs with weight. I felt my heartbeat quicken. I knew it was unlikely to be a bear. There were no signs of tracks nearby, but it could have been smaller animals, a pack of coyotes, or something I hadn't anticipated. The sounds circled my campsite, sometimes coming from one side, then another. I remained still, listening, trying not to panic. My flashlight was ready, my knife within reach. I told myself that if something got too close, I could defend myself or scare it away with the fire. Hours passed slowly. The fire burned lower, and I added small sticks to keep it alive. The noises continued intermittently, sometimes close enough that I could hear the snapping of branches under weight. Every time I turned my flashlight toward a sound, nothing was there. The darkness seemed to stretch endlessly, and the isolation pressed on me. I realized that I had underestimated how vulnerable I was. Even though I had been careful, the wilderness was unpredictable. I thought about the possibility of injury or encountering something dangerous, and the thought made me more alert. I checked my map and compass several times, making sure I knew the way back to the trailhead in the morning. I also made mental notes of landmarks in case I had to move quickly. Sleep felt impossible. The idea of sleeping alone in that remote spot, with noises circling me, was unsettling. I alternated between watching the fire, checking the perimeter, and scanning the night sky for movement. Then I heard the first unmistakable sound. A low growl, deep and deliberate, coming from the trees below the plateau. I froze. My mind raced. I knew bears could be in this area, though they were rare, and I had taken precautions. Food packed securely, no strong scents outside. But this was no random animal sound. It was close enough to be immediate, enough to make me realize that I might not be as safe as I thought. I slowly reached for my flashlight, careful not to make sudden movements. The growl repeated, this time accompanied by the sound of heavy steps on loose rocks. I felt my stomach knot, and my hands trembled slightly. I thought about my options. Running would be dangerous, especially in the dark and on uneven terrain. Staying in the tent felt risky if the creature tried to investigate. I realized that the safest place was near the fire. Most animals avoid flames, and the light would make me more visible to anything around. I gathered more branches and small logs, adding them to the fire, letting it burn higher and brighter. The sounds approached closer, then paused, as if the creature was unsure. The growl came again, louder this time, and then I heard a branch snap just a few meters away. I held my breath, listening to every detail. The night was otherwise silent, but the rustling near the edge of the plateau was intense, deliberate, and unnerving. Hours passed in tense vigilance. I did not sleep. I only watched, listened, and kept the fire alive. At one point, the growling stopped entirely. It was so quiet that I could hear my own breathing. I thought it might have left, but I could not be certain. I kept small sticks in my hand, ready to throw if necessary. By the early hours of the morning, I realized the noises had faded into occasional distant rustles. I was exhausted mentally and physically, but I dared not sleep fully. I rested in short bursts, always with one eye on the surroundings and one hand near my knife. When the first light of dawn appeared, I felt relief wash over me. The woods looked different in daylight, less threatening, more familiar. I began to make a plan to leave. I had a clear path back, and I decided to pack carefully but quickly. I dismantled my campsite, making sure to remove all traces: trash, food, and even small scraps of toilet paper. I double-checked that I left nothing behind that could attract wildlife later. By the time the sun was fully up, I had my backpack on and was descending the trail. The hike back was grueling. My legs ached from the climb, and my nerves were still on edge from the night. I was hyper-aware of every sound, every movement in the trees. Even birds or squirrels made me tense, expecting the worst. But gradually, as I descended, the environment became less intimidating. I passed the stream again, refilling my water bottle and drinking cautiously after boiling the water. I rested only briefly, knowing that the farther I went, the closer I would be to safety. By midday, I reached the trailhead and saw my car. I felt an overwhelming sense of relief, almost disbelief that I had survived the night unharmed. My hands shook as I unpacked the backpack, and I sat in the car, exhausted. The experience had been far more intense than I anticipated. The fear of being alone in the wilderness, the unknown presence of animals, the isolation, and the darkness had been crushing. But I had endured it, carefully planning, staying alert, and using every precaution I had learned. I drove home slowly, still shaken, but proud of managing a dangerous situation. In the following days, I reflected on the experience. I realized that the forest had no malice. It was simply indifferent. The fear came from being unprepared for the unpredictable. I wrote down everything I learned. The importance of keeping food secured, staying aware of surroundings, the value of a strong fire, and having mental strategies to deal with fear and exhaustion. I also decided that future trips would be less extreme, prioritizing safety over isolation. But I knew one thing for certain. I had faced real fear and survived it on my own, without anyone else's help. And that gave me a sense of resilience I had never felt before. It was a clear, tangible lesson in respect for the wilderness and in self-reliance, one that would stay with me for the rest of my life. From that trip onward, every time I saw the mountains or heard a rustle in the trees, I remembered that night. Not as a ghost story, not as fantasy, but as a vivid, real encounter with nature in its raw, unpredictable form, and I knew I had faced it head-on and come out stronger. I had been looking forward to this camping trip for months. I had planned everything meticulously. The route, the food, the gear, even the backup maps in case I got lost. I wanted to escape the city for a while, to breathe fresh air, and to test myself in the wilderness. The trail I picked was deep in the mountains, far from the nearest town, with very few hikers venturing there because of its rugged terrain. I thought the remoteness would make it more exciting, maybe even thrilling. I didn't know it would almost cost me everything. I started the hike early in the morning. The air was crisp, the sun barely touching the peaks in the distance, and the forest smelled of wet soil and pine. My backpack was heavy, but it carried everything I might need. A tent, a sleeping bag, a portable stove, water, canned food, extra clothes, and a first aid kit. I wore sturdy boots, thick socks, and a waterproof jacket in case it rained. As I walked, I felt a rush of freedom, like nothing in the city could reach me here. The trail was narrow, winding, and overgrown in some areas. Every step I took crunched on dry leaves or snapped twigs, echoing in the quiet forest. By midday, I reached a clearing that overlooked a small valley. I decided it was the perfect spot to set up camp. The ground was level, the trees offered some shade, and there was a small stream nearby for water. I unpacked everything, pitched the tent, and gathered wood for a fire. The forest around me was alive with the sounds of birds, rustling leaves, and the occasional distant scream of a wild animal, maybe a fox or a hawk. I felt completely alone, but in a way that was both peaceful and slightly unnerving. As the afternoon passed, I explored the area around the campsite. I followed the stream a little downstream and found a small waterfall. The water was clear and cold, perfect for drinking after filtering it through my portable purifier. I collected some extra wood for the fire while watching the water rush over rocks. The sun was warm, but the air had a chill that made me pull my jacket tighter. I felt a strange sense of awareness, noticing the subtle noises in the forest. The snap of a branch, a rustle in the bushes, but I brushed it off as my mind being too alert. After all, I had done my research. I knew the area was mostly safe from large predators, and I had read that human encounters were extremely rare. When I returned to camp, I started a fire. The flames licked the wood, and the warmth was comforting. I boiled water, cooked some canned beans, and ate slowly, savoring the quiet and the simplicity. As dusk approached, the forest changed. Shadows grew long, and the sounds of wildlife became louder. Birds quieted, insects hummed, and somewhere, a small animal scuttled through the leaves. I felt that old thrill of isolation, the same one that made people go hiking or camping in the first place. But as the night deepened, the thrill slowly shifted into unease. I went inside the tent to sleep, leaving a small fire burning outside for warmth and safety. The darkness around me was complete, except for the flickering glow from the fire. I tried to relax, thinking about the hike ahead tomorrow. Then I heard it, the first noise that made my stomach twist. At first, it was subtle, a faint crunching of leaves. I froze, listening. The noise came from beyond the firelight, somewhere in the forest, moving closer. My mind raced. Could it be a deer? A fox? It was hard to tell in the darkness. I sat still, heart pounding, trying to make myself think logically. The noise repeated, slower this time, deliberate. Something large was moving through the forest toward my campsite. I didn't hear it breaking branches as a deer would. The rustling was heavier, more measured, and it seemed to circle the tent. My first instinct was to grab my backpack, but I had left my flashlight inside. The fire had begun to die down, casting weak shadows that flickered and danced like phantoms. Minutes passed, which felt like hours. The rustling continued, circling, approaching, retreating slightly, then returning. I realized I was not dealing with a small animal. It was too heavy, too controlled. My mind ran through the possibilities. A bear? A mountain lion? Or worse, a human? My stomach tightened as I thought about how exposed I was. My tent offered little protection. The thought of being alone, deep in the forest, with something potentially dangerous stalking me, made my skin crawl. I decided I had to act. I grabbed my flashlight and slowly unzipped the tent, trying not to make a sound. Outside, the fire had dwindled to glowing embers, casting barely any light. I swept the flashlight through the trees, the beam catching nothing at first. Then I saw it. A large shape moving just beyond the firelight, barely visible. It was crouched low, watching. My heart slammed against my chest. It was too big for a deer, too bulky to be a fox. My first thought was a bear, though its movements seemed oddly human-like at moments, deliberate, almost calculating. I knew I had to get out. Slowly, I retreated from the tent toward my backpack, grabbing my emergency whistle and knife. I realized if it attacked, I needed a plan. My first priority was distance, then finding higher ground. I quietly packed essential items: water, food, a small first aid kit, and my phone. The rest of my gear could be replaced. As I moved, I heard the shape shift and snap a branch. I froze. It hadn't spotted me yet, but the moment felt fragile, hanging on a thin line of chance. I made a decision. I would climb a nearby slope to put myself above the creature. My backpack was heavy, slowing me down, but adrenaline drove me forward. The forest was dark and tangled, roots catching my boots, branches slapping against my jacket. I moved carefully but quickly, trying not to make more noise than necessary. Behind me, I thought I heard footsteps, heavier than any animal I knew. The air felt thick, suffocating with tension. After what felt like forever, I reached a rocky outcrop overlooking the campsite. From this vantage, I could see the faint outline of the figure circling the fire. My hands shook as I clutched the flashlight. The figure was massive, broad-shouldered, and hunched. Its movements were slow, deliberate, almost like it was searching for something specific. I didn't know if it had seen me. I held my breath, trying to disappear into the shadows. Hours passed like this. I stayed on the rocks, barely moving, listening to the rustling below. The fire had gone out completely, leaving only the faint glow of embers. The creature moved closer to the tent, sniffing the air, circling, investigating. Every sound made me flinch. My body ached. My mouth was dry, but I couldn't risk descending or making noise. My phone had no signal. Calling for help was impossible. I was trapped, relying on my own wits. Eventually, as dawn began to break, the creature retreated. I didn't see it leave, but the sounds of movement faded into the forest. I waited another hour, watching carefully before descending. The campsite was trashed. My tent slashed, my gear scattered, footprints leading in several directions. Nothing was missing except my food and a few small items I hadn't considered essential. I realized I had been incredibly lucky. Something had been here, maybe a human or a bear, but whatever it was, it had chosen to leave. I packed what I could salvage and began the hike back down the mountain. Every step was careful, my senses on high alert, scanning for movement, listening to every sound. The forest seemed peaceful now, almost innocent in the morning light, but I knew better. I had been exposed to something dangerous, something that could have ended badly in countless ways. By the time I reached the main trail and saw signs of other hikers, relief washed over me. I was safe, unharmed, and utterly exhausted. Back at my car, I took a long look at the forest behind me. It seemed quiet and welcoming in the daylight, but I knew the memory of that night would linger. I drove home slowly, tired but grateful to be alive. That trip taught me more than any guidebook ever could. The wilderness is beautiful, but it is also unpredictable and sometimes frightening. Respecting it, being prepared, and staying alert is not just wise. It can be the difference between life and death. I had escaped without injury, and I knew I would never forget the sharp, tense fear of being watched, stalked, and completely alone in the dark. I had been planning the trip for months, going over every detail in my head, checking and double-checking my equipment, imagining the peaceful isolation of the forest, the calm nights, the escape from the city, the smell of pine and wet earth. I wanted something away from people, far enough that even the hum of traffic would feel like a memory. I packed my gear carefully. A sturdy tent, a sleeping bag rated for sub-zero temperatures, a portable stove, enough food for a week, a first aid kit, and most importantly, a good knife and a fully charged satellite phone. My plan was simple. I'd hike deep into the national forest, find a remote clearing, camp there for a few nights, and then hike back. I wanted solitude, and I wanted the sense of being completely self-reliant. The first day of the hike was uneventful, though exhausting. The trail was steep in places, slippery from recent rains, and my pack felt heavier than I expected. I passed a few other hikers early in the morning, but as the day went on, I noticed the trail getting narrower and less maintained. Branches scratched at my arms and legs, and the mud made me slide occasionally, but I pushed on. By late afternoon, I reached a small creek running through the forest. I decided it would be a good place to rest, filter some water, and refill my bottle. The sound of the flowing water was soothing. I took my time, washing my face and drinking deeply. After a short break, I continued along the creek, keeping my eyes out for a good spot to set up camp. As evening approached, I found a small clearing surrounded by dense trees. The ground was uneven but dry, and it was close enough to the creek to hear water running, which I knew would help me feel safe. I pitched my tent carefully, making sure the stakes were secure, and cleared away leaves and small branches that might poke through the bottom. I set up my stove and heated some soup, which I ate while watching the sun sink behind the trees, leaving long shadows that stretched across the clearing. I had the sense that I was completely alone, and the solitude felt good, until the sun disappeared entirely, and the forest became darker than I had imagined. Night brought with it a heavy silence. The usual sounds of insects and rustling leaves were there, but they were punctuated by more distant noises I couldn't identify at first. Twigs snapping, leaves rustling, the occasional low growl or bark of a distant animal. I reminded myself that I was in bear country, and even though attacks are rare, they are a real danger. I made sure to keep all food sealed in a bear-proof bag and hung it high in a tree near the creek, just out of reach. Around midnight, I woke to a noise outside the tent. At first, I thought it was the wind, or maybe a branch falling. But then I realized the sound was different. It was deliberate, slow, and moving. Something was circling the clearing. My heart started pounding, and I quietly reached for my flashlight and my knife. The beam of the flashlight cut through the darkness, and I could see nothing at first. Then, a shape moved just beyond the trees, too large to be a deer, moving with careful steps. My mind raced. Bear, wolf, maybe even a large wild boar. I remembered the advice to remain calm and not make sudden movements. I turned on a small, portable bear whistle I always carried, and blew it softly. The sound was sharp and piercing, and I saw the figure freeze for a moment, then vanish into the trees. I spent the rest of the night awake, every sense alert, listening to the forest, noting every sound, every shadow. Sleep didn't come easily, but when it did, It was shallow and filled with dreams of being attacked or lost. Morning arrived, and with it a heavy fog that hung low over the creek. I decided to break camp early. I wanted to put more distance between myself and whatever had been circling me. As I packed, I noticed footprints near the edge of the clearing, large, heavy, not human, probably a bear. The weight of the realization pressed on me. I was lucky I hadn't drawn its attention more directly. I decided to change my route and stay closer to the main trail, keeping the creek on my right for navigation. The next day was uneventful in comparison, though tiring. Hiking with tension constantly in the back of my mind made every step more exhausting. By late afternoon, I realized I had miscalculated my timing. The sun was already dipping low, and I was still several miles from any designated camping area. I had to find shelter fast. I noticed a rocky outcrop that offered some protection from the wind and began clearing an area nearby to pitch my tent. As I worked, I kept scanning the forest around me. The air had a strange stillness. Even the birds had gone quiet. I slept fitfully that night, dreams filled with shadows moving just beyond the edge of my vision. Around 3 a.m., I woke to the sound of movement again. This time it was closer. Something large was moving through the underbrush just 10 or 15 meters from my tent. I froze, holding my breath, listening. Then, a low growl rumbled through the darkness. I knew a bear had found my location. I stayed perfectly still, hoping it would move on. The growl came again, closer this time, then the sound of a branch snapping. My heart was hammering so hard I thought it might wake the bear. I slowly reached for my flashlight, aiming it toward the sound. The beam landed on a massive brown bear, its eyes reflecting the light. My body was rigid with fear. I remembered the survival advice. Never run from a bear, never turn your back. The bear stayed for several minutes, sniffing the air, circling slightly. I could see its powerful muscles and sharp claws, and I realized that I had to stay completely calm to survive. I slowly reached for my bear spray, keeping my eyes on the animal. After what felt like an eternity, the bear turned and disappeared into the forest. I waited a long time before moving again, heart still pounding, hands shaking. Morning came with a sense of relief but also a new urgency. I decided to hike out immediately, cutting through the trail that would bring me back to the nearest ranger station. The forest seemed less threatening in the daylight, but the memory of the bear haunted every step. I moved quickly, trying not to make too much noise, scanning for any other animals. The trail was rugged, roots and rocks making progress slow. By the second day of hiking out, I was exhausted, dehydrated, and sore. I had rationed my food carefully, drinking only as much water as necessary, filtering it from the creek. The fear of encountering another bear kept me alert. My senses heightened to every sound, smell, and movement. I kept reminding myself of the basics. Stay calm, move steadily, observe the terrain, keep my knife ready, and maintain confidence in my ability to survive. Late in the afternoon, I finally caught sight of the ranger station in the distance. The relief was overwhelming. I moved faster, my body sore but fueled by adrenaline and the certainty that I had made it. When I arrived, the rangers were shocked at the state I was in. Scratches on my arms and legs from branches, dirt caked into my hair and clothes, eyes wide from fatigue and fear. I told them about the bear, the night noises, the feeling of being stalked. They nodded gravely, confirming that there had been a bear spotted in the area recently, aggressive and searching for food. I spent the night at the ranger station, exhausted but safe, sleeping on a cot while they checked my injuries and gave me water and food. I felt the tension draining from my body slowly, realizing how close I had come to a dangerous encounter. The following morning, they provided me with a safe route back to my car and checked in on me as I left. As I drove away from the forest, the relief was profound. I had survived the wilderness, faced a dangerous predator, and emerged unharmed, though shaken. The experience taught me several things. Planning and preparation are essential, but so is respect for nature and its unpredictability. Even with all the equipment and knowledge in the world, you are still vulnerable to the raw power of the wild. I realized that solitude in nature can be beautiful, but it also comes with risks that demand constant attention, awareness, and caution. From that day on, my respect for the wilderness grew deeper, tempered by the memory of the fear and the adrenaline of those nights in the forest. Returning home, I unpacked my gear, cleaned it, and stored it carefully. The scratches on my arms healed, but the memory of the bear's eyes, the sound of its growl, and the stillness of the forest at night remained vivid. I never went camping alone again in deep wilderness, choosing instead to go with friends or in areas with better monitoring. The forest had tested me, and I had survived, but it had left its mark on me, a constant reminder of the thin line between safety and danger in the wild. I had been planning this camping trip for months. I wanted to get away from the constant noise of the city, from the endless pressure at work and the constant pull of screens and emails. I had chosen a remote area in the mountains that I had read about online. The trail was supposed to be quiet, with few hikers passing through, and it offered a small clearing where I could set up camp near a stream. It seemed perfect. I packed my gear carefully: tent, sleeping bag, extra food, a portable stove, a first aid kit, a flashlight, and plenty of water. I also had a map, though I had studied the area online so much that I thought I could manage without needing to consult it too often. The first day was uneventful. The air was crisp and smelled of pine and damp earth. Birds sang faintly, and the trail wound up through the trees, past moss-covered rocks and fallen logs. I moved slowly, enjoying the quiet and the effort of hiking with a fully loaded backpack. Every so often, I paused to look at the view through the trees. Valleys stretched far below, rivers winding like silver ribbons, and peaks rising beyond in jagged lines. I felt a strange mix of calm and excitement, a sense that I had finally left everything behind. I reached the clearing around mid-afternoon. The stream ran clear and cold, rushing over smooth stones. There was a flat area near the water that seemed ideal for the tent. I set it up carefully, making sure the corners were tight and the rain flap was secure, though the sky was clear. I gathered some firewood from the surrounding forest, small dead branches and some larger logs, and stacked them near a rock formation I would use as a windbreak. By the time I had finished, the sun was dipping lower, sending long shadows across the clearing. The first night passed quietly, though I woke once to the sound of rustling in the underbrush. My heart had leapt, but when I shone my flashlight toward the sound, I saw nothing but shadows of branches moving in the wind. I had told myself it was a deer, or perhaps a raccoon, and managed to calm myself enough to fall asleep again. The next day, I decided to explore a little farther up the trail. I wanted to reach a viewpoint I had read about, a rocky outcrop that offered a panorama of the surrounding mountains. The climb was steep, and my legs ached more than I expected, but the effort was worth it. The view was breathtaking. I sat on a large boulder, eating a small snack, drinking water, and just breathing in the quiet. There was no one else in sight, and I felt a strange exhilaration at being entirely alone in such a vast, untouched place. I returned to camp in the late afternoon, tired but satisfied. I cooked a simple meal over the fire, dried noodles with a little dehydrated vegetables, and ate slowly, savoring the warmth of the flames as the sun began to set. The sky turned deep orange and then purple, and stars began to appear one by one. It was beautiful, but as darkness fell, I felt a subtle shift in the atmosphere. The forest seemed different at night, heavier, more alive. Every crack of a twig or rustle of leaves was amplified, and shadows seemed to move just out of the corner of my eye. I told myself I was being paranoid, but a small part of me remained uneasy. The next morning, I decided to follow the stream a little farther downstream. I wanted to find a better water source and maybe a place to fish, just in case. I packed my small day bag, leaving the tent and most of my supplies behind, and headed off. The forest grew denser as I moved away from the clearing. The ground was uneven, and roots and rocks threatened to trip me with every step. I kept my eyes on the path ahead, listening to the constant rush of the stream. Occasionally, I spotted small animals, squirrels darting up trees, birds flitting from branch to branch. Around midday, I realized I had gone farther than I intended. The stream curved sharply, and the terrain grew steeper. I had to use my hands to climb over rocks and push past thick underbrush. I paused often, drinking water and resting my shoulders and legs. That's when I noticed something unusual: the tracks. At first, I thought they were animal prints, but they were too large and irregular. They looked like footprints, deep in the soft mud along the stream's edge. I froze and studied them carefully. They were human, unmistakably so, and they seemed fresh. My heart began to race. The tracks led downstream toward my camp. I debated whether to turn back immediately, but my curiosity got the better of me. I followed the prints cautiously, keeping low behind trees and rocks, listening for any sound. The forest was quiet, almost unnaturally so. There was no bird song, no rustle of small animals, nothing but the sound of my own breathing and the stream. The prints led me around a bend, and I saw something that made my stomach tighten. Broken branches, footprints on the softer ground that weren't mine, and faint signs of someone moving through the area. It looked as if someone had been watching the clearing. Panic set in. I realized I had underestimated the risks of being alone in a remote area. Someone could be nearby, following me, maybe even planning to steal my supplies, or worse. I didn't want to show fear, but my hands were shaking. I decided to move quietly and get back to the clearing as fast as possible. I retraced my steps carefully, keeping my eyes peeled for anyone else. The forest seemed denser and darker than before, and every sound startled me. My pulse was pounding. By the time I reached the clearing, the sun was low on the horizon. My heart sank. The tent flap was slightly open. My firewood had been disturbed, and small items near the tent were out of place. Someone had been here while I was away. I immediately thought about calling for help, but there was no cell service. I couldn't rely on anyone hearing me. I had to make a decision quickly. I decided the safest option was to leave immediately, even though it meant abandoning some of my gear. I packed only the essentials: water, food, map, compass, first aid kit, and flashlight. I left the tent and most of my supplies behind. I moved quickly but cautiously, heading toward the main trail I had taken in. The forest seemed to close in around me. Every snapped twig made me flinch, and I kept imagining someone following me. I stayed near the stream, hoping the sound would mask my movements. As darkness fell completely, I realized I had underestimated how difficult it would be to navigate the forest at night. I switched on my flashlight, but the beam only lit a small area in front of me. I slipped several times, caught my foot on roots, and had to scramble over rocks. My legs and shoulders burned from exhaustion. Every step was a struggle, but I forced myself to keep moving, reminding myself that stopping would make me vulnerable. Around 2 hours into my trek, I heard it. A faint sound, footsteps not my own, echoing through the trees. I froze, listening. It stopped when I stopped, resumed when I moved. Someone was following me. My fear spiked. I remembered reading about hikers who had been attacked in remote areas, and I realized how unprepared I had been. I considered hiding, but there was nowhere to hide in the open forest near the stream. I had to keep moving. I altered my route slightly, moving away from the stream into denser forest, hoping to throw off whoever was behind me. I climbed a small rise and used the shadows to my advantage, keeping low. My mind raced, trying to plan my escape. I thought about heading toward a nearby road I had seen on the map, but it was several miles away, and I wasn't sure I could make it in the dark. After what felt like hours, I saw a faint glimmer of light through the trees. Relief washed over me. It was the reflection of a headlamp, probably from another hiker or a ranger. I shouted, hoping to attract attention. The light moved toward me, and soon I saw a man with a flashlight coming down the trail. I ran toward him, waving my arms, and he quickly approached. I explained as best I could, though my voice shook. He nodded, understanding immediately. He had been patrolling the area and had noticed signs of someone moving through campsites without permission. He led me back toward a ranger station at the edge of the park. On the way, he assured me that the area would be checked, and that I had done the right thing by leaving my gear and getting help instead of confronting anyone alone. By the time we reached the station, I was exhausted, dehydrated, and shaking from the adrenaline. They offered water and food and allowed me to call a friend to let them know I was safe. I sat there for a long time trying to process what had happened. My gear was gone, but I was alive. I thought about how easy it had been for someone to move unseen through the forest, and how unprepared I had been for the realities of being alone in such a remote place. The following days were spent recovering physically and mentally. I went back to the clearing once with rangers to check what remained. Most of my gear had been taken, but thankfully nothing valuable in terms of identification or money. I filed a report, and they increased patrols in the area to prevent further incidents. Looking back, the experience left a deep impression on me. It taught me the importance of preparation, situational awareness, and respect for the risks that come with wilderness exploration. I realized that being alone in nature is not just peaceful or beautiful. It can be dangerous if caution is not exercised. I also learned the value of instincts, paying attention to signs, noticing tracks, and reacting quickly. I eventually returned to camping, but never alone in such remote areas again. I always made sure someone knew my exact route, and I carried extra safety equipment, including a personal locator beacon. I learned to respect the wilderness, not just as a place of beauty, but as a place where unpredictability can test every skill and instinct you have. The forest remains the same as it was, indifferent and vast, and I understand now that survival often depends less on luck and more on preparation, awareness, and the ability to act decisively when danger appears. I survived that trip, and the lessons I learned will stay with me forever, shaping every adventure I undertake in the wild. I had been planning this camping trip for months, and I thought I had prepared everything down to the smallest detail. The plan was simple: hike into a remote section of the mountains, set up camp by a small lake I had discovered on a topographic map, fish a little, take photos, and spend a few nights alone in the forest. I had done solo trips before, but nothing this isolated. The road to the trailhead had been long and winding, narrow dirt paths that cut through old pines and oak groves. By the time I parked my car, the sun was low, and the shadows stretched long across the ground. The air smelled faintly of wet soil and pine needles, the kind of smell that sinks into your memory when you spend long enough in the woods. I should have noticed that the parking area was almost empty, with only one other vehicle far off near the trailhead. It wasn't a popular place, and that was why I had chosen it. Isolation promised peace, quiet, and the chance to be fully immersed in the forest. I double-checked my pack, tent, sleeping bag, food, water, stove, first aid kit, map, compass, headlamp, and backup batteries. Everything was accounted for. My hiking boots crunched over the dry leaves as I headed toward the trail, the steep incline becoming sharper with every step. I was fit, used to long treks, so the initial climb didn't feel punishing. The trail itself was narrow, almost overgrown in places, with roots snaking across the dirt, making each step something you had to consciously watch. Birds darted through the trees, their calls echoing in the canyons between ridges, and I felt the familiar thrill of being somewhere that felt untouched by civilization. Hours passed quickly. I paused only occasionally to drink water, eat a snack, or photograph an unusual rock formation or the sunlight breaking through the canopy. By late afternoon, I reached the ridge that overlooked the small lake I had seen on the map. The lake was smaller than I had imagined, but no less beautiful. The water was still, reflecting the golden glow of the setting sun. A flat clearing near the shore looked perfect for my tent. I dropped my pack, letting out a long sigh, feeling the ache in my shoulders and legs. As I began setting up the tent, I noticed the wind picking up slightly, rustling the leaves and causing small ripples on the lake's surface. The smell of wet earth grew stronger as the sun dipped lower, and the temperature began to drop. By the time the tent was secured, darkness was approaching. I cooked a small meal over my portable stove, the smell of simmering rice and beans mixing with the forest scent. I ate slowly, savoring the quiet and the isolation, feeling a kind of contentment that only comes from being completely alone in nature. After cleaning up, I crawled into my sleeping bag, laying my head against my backpack and staring at the small opening of the tent. The light outside was fading, leaving everything in shades of gray and black. It was then that I heard the first unusual sound. At first, I thought it was a branch snapping in the wind, but it was too distinct. A sharp crack, followed by a softer thud. My heart rate increased slightly, but I reminded myself that forests are full of wildlife. Deer, raccoons, squirrels. I told myself it was probably just an animal moving through the underbrush. But the sound continued, irregular and deliberate, almost as if someone or something was walking around the perimeter of the clearing. I sat up, my hands gripping the edges of the tent flap. I had a small flashlight in my pocket, so I turned it on and scanned the area. The beam of light hit the trees, the lake, and the ground, but there was nothing. Just shadows and the faint reflection of the water. I told myself to calm down and lie back down, but every sound, the rustling of leaves, the occasional snap of a twig, made me tense. I finally forced myself to sleep, though my dreams were shallow, fragmented, and filled with the feeling of being watched. I woke in the middle of the night to a louder, closer sound. Footsteps, or at least something moving carefully through the leaves. My stomach twisted. I didn't feel fear yet, just an intense awareness, a hypervigilance. I reached for my headlamp and shone it outside the tent. For a moment, I thought I saw a figure, a shadow that moved between the trees, but I wasn't sure if it was real or a trick of the light. I stayed still, holding my breath, listening. Then nothing. Silence returned, heavy and almost oppressive. Morning came, but I didn't feel rested. I packed up the tent faster than usual, eating only a small portion of my breakfast. The air felt different now, thicker, charged. As I hiked toward a better vantage point to fish and explore, I noticed that the footprints in the dirt near my campsite had changed. I hadn't seen anyone else come through, yet there were fresh tracks, human, unmistakably human, leading from the forest edge toward the lake and then circling back toward the woods. My chest tightened, and I forced myself to focus. These weren't animal tracks. I spent the day carefully fishing and moving along the shoreline, keeping my eyes constantly scanning the treeline. Every time a branch snapped or a bird took flight, I flinched. I stayed aware of escape routes, planning how I could leave quickly if needed. The sun was high, but the shadows of the forest seemed longer and darker than before. I kept my phone close, but there was no signal. If something went wrong, I would have to rely on my own wits. As evening approached, I noticed movement across the lake. A shadow, too large and deliberate to be a deer. I ducked behind a rock, watching. Whatever it was, it stayed on the far shore, partially hidden by trees. I couldn't tell what it was, but the way it moved made my stomach drop. It didn't seem like it was hunting animals. It was watching, and then it was gone, leaving only ripples in the water where it had stepped. That night, I didn't eat. I sat in my tent with the flashlight and a small knife I carried for emergencies. Every sound felt amplified. The wind rattling leaves, the lake lapping at the shore, the occasional distant animal cry. I stayed awake for hours, heart racing, muscles tensed, listening for any indication that the figure was nearby. At one point, I thought I heard someone moving outside, circling the tent. I held the knife in both hands, ready, but eventually exhaustion won. I woke again in the dark, but this time the footsteps were unmistakable. Slow, deliberate, moving along the edge of the clearing. My hand tightened on the knife. The tent shook slightly, and I realized that if someone wanted to, they could easily tear the fabric and reach inside. I stayed completely still, focusing on my breathing, counting slowly to 15, then 20, and the footsteps stopped. Then silence again. Dawn came, pale and cold, and with it the most important decision. I had to leave. I couldn't wait for whoever or whatever was out there. I packed quickly, my hands shaking, leaving no trace behind, and started moving down the trail. Every step was cautious, every sound alarming. But I didn't stop. I kept moving, navigating the roots and rocks with care. I didn't look back, not once. It was mid-morning when I finally reached my car. I locked the doors immediately and sat inside for several minutes, trying to catch my breath. letting the feeling of safety slowly return. I called a friend to let them know I was okay, but even over the phone, my hands shook. I didn't know who or what had been following me, but I knew I had been lucky. The rest of the day was a blur. Driving down the winding mountain roads, I kept glancing into the woods, expecting to see movement, expecting to feel that same unease creeping back. I stopped only for gas and food, staying on the move until I was well clear of the area. Once I reached the safety of my apartment, I unpacked slowly, checking everything, making sure nothing had been tampered with. Nothing had been, and yet the memory of those footsteps, the shadows, and the feeling of being watched lingered. I reported the incident to the local ranger station a few days later. They noted my account and mentioned that there had been reports of people encountering hikers and campers in the area who had been robbed or harassed, usually by someone who knew the trails well. They confirmed there had been no formal arrests, which explained nothing but validated the reality of the threat. After that, I never returned to that lake. I avoided remote trails for months, only venturing into areas that had other people around. And though I eventually returned to hiking and camping, I never again underestimated how vulnerable you can be when you are truly alone in the wilderness. The experience taught me vigilance, preparedness, and a deep respect for the isolation of nature. That trip, terrifying as it was, ended with me safe and unharmed, but it left an impression I will never forget. A reminder that the most dangerous things in the woods are not legends or ghosts, but people and circumstances you cannot predict. Even now, years later, whenever I hike or camp in a quiet, isolated area, I carry extra precautions, double-check my surroundings constantly, and trust my instincts above all else. Nature is beautiful and peaceful, but it is also indifferent, and in that indifference, humans can become dangerously exposed. I survived, and I know I will survive again, but I will never take solitude for granted. I had been planning the camping trip for months, carefully choosing the location, packing all the necessary equipment, and making sure I was ready for anything the wilderness could throw at me. I wanted to escape the noise and stress of the city for a few days and just be alone in nature, surrounded by the silence of the forest, the smell of pine, and the crisp air that only comes from being far from human settlements. My destination was a small, secluded campsite deep in the mountains, a place I had read about in a local outdoor magazine. The trail to get there was not heavily trafficked, which was exactly what I wanted. I was excited, though I also felt a slight knot of apprehension, the kind that comes when you are about to step entirely outside your comfort zone. The drive up the mountain was long and winding. The road was narrow and often littered with loose gravel and fallen branches. At times, the road was so steep that my car struggled, and I had to inch forward carefully to avoid sliding on the loose stones. The trees grew denser as I ascended, their tall trunks creating a canopy that filtered the sunlight into soft, green shadows. The further I went, the quieter it became. The sound of cars, people, and the occasional distant train faded away until there was only the whisper of the wind through the leaves and the occasional bird call. By the time I reached the parking area near the trailhead, I felt almost entirely removed from civilization, a feeling that was both exhilarating and slightly unnerving. I started the hike in the late morning, carrying a backpack loaded with supplies. A tent, sleeping bag, extra clothes, food for 3 days, water, cooking equipment, first aid supplies, a flashlight, and some emergency gear. The trail began fairly easy, a dirt path winding through a forest of pine and maple trees. Sunlight dappled the forest floor, and the air smelled of damp earth and pine resin. I noticed small details, the way moss clung to the north side of the trees, the faint tracks of deer and rabbits, and the occasional broken branch that hinted at something larger passing through. The forest was alive, but quiet, and I felt a sense of peace I rarely found in the city. As the hours passed, the trail grew steeper and more rugged. Rocks jutted out from the ground, roots twisted across the path, and in some places the slope became so steep that I had to use my hands to steady myself. I took regular breaks, drinking water, eating small snacks, and scanning the area to make sure I was aware of my surroundings. I was alone, and I knew that even a small mistake could turn dangerous. But part of the thrill of being in the wilderness alone was that sense of vulnerability, the awareness that I had to rely entirely on myself. Around mid-afternoon, I reached a small clearing with a stream running through it. The sound of water was refreshing, and I decided to rest there for a while. I filled my water bottles, washed my face, and sat on a flat rock to eat some trail mix. The stream babbled softly, and sunlight reflected off the water in tiny sparkling patterns. I watched a pair of squirrels chase each other across the rocks and listened to the distant call of a hawk. It was perfect, serene, exactly the kind of moment I had been hoping for. I pushed on, the trail continuing to climb through increasingly dense forest. The trees grew taller and closer together, and the underbrush became thicker. By late afternoon, I was starting to feel the strain of the hike. My legs ached, my shoulders were sore from the weight of my pack, and I was beginning to notice the sun dipping lower in the sky. I knew I needed to find a suitable campsite soon. I had hoped to reach the official camping area marked on the map, but as I looked around, I realized I might have to settle for a spot off the trail. I wanted somewhere flat, dry, and safe from any potential hazards. Eventually, I found a small, natural clearing not far from the trail, sheltered by a ring of trees and slightly elevated above the ground to avoid any water runoff. The area was covered in soft moss and pine needles, and the ground was mostly level. I decided this would be my spot for the night. Setting up the tent took some time, and I moved slowly to make sure it was secure. The wind had picked up slightly, rustling the branches above and creating shadows that danced across the ground. I worked carefully, making sure my tent stakes were firm and the rain fly was properly in place, even though the weather forecast had predicted clear skies. Once the tent was ready, I started preparing dinner. I set up a small portable stove and heated some water for a simple freeze-dried meal. The forest was growing darker as the sun dipped behind the mountain ridges, and I was acutely aware of the deepening shadows around me. The sounds of the forest were more pronounced now, the chirping of crickets, the rustle of leaves, and the occasional snap of a twig in the distance. I reminded myself that I was in a natural environment, and these noises were normal, even comforting in their way, though I also felt a subtle tension I couldn't quite shake. After eating, I cleaned up my cooking area carefully, making sure no food scraps were left that might attract wildlife. Bears were not common in this area, but I still took precautions, storing my food in a bear-proof container and hanging it from a tree branch away from my tent. As the darkness fully settled, I turned on my headlamp briefly to check my surroundings and then settled into my sleeping bag. The sky was clear, revealing a brilliant display of stars. The air was crisp and cool, and I felt a sense of satisfaction and contentment from the day's accomplishments. I told myself I would get a good night's sleep, knowing I had hiked far and needed rest for tomorrow's planned exploration. However, just as I was drifting off, I became aware of a noise outside the tent, a low, continuous rustling coming from the direction of the trees. My first instinct was to freeze and listen carefully. The sound was deliberate, not random, and it seemed to move closer, then pause, then move again. I reminded myself that I was in the forest and animals were active at night, but there was something about the rhythm of this sound that made me uneasy. It wasn't like the scurrying of a small animal. It had weight behind it, as if something larger was moving through the underbrush. I reached for my flashlight and shone it toward the source of the sound, but the dense shadows swallowed the beam almost instantly. I could see nothing, only the faint outlines of trees swaying slightly in the breeze. The rustling continued, and I realized I was not just hearing it. Something was approaching my tent deliberately. My heart rate increased, and I considered my options. I could stay in the tent and wait, hoping whatever it was would pass, or I could attempt to scare it away with noise or light. I remembered my bear spray, stored in an accessible pocket, and slowly reached for it, keeping the beam of my flashlight directed at the dark shapes outside. The rustling grew louder, and then I heard the unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps on moss-covered ground. Whatever it was big and it was close. My mind raced through possibilities: bear, wild boar, even human, but I had no way to be certain. Suddenly, the sound stopped. Silence settled over the forest like a heavy blanket. I held my breath, listening intently. The lack of movement was worse than the noise because I knew that whatever had been moving was still there, just waiting or watching. Minutes passed like hours, and I realized I needed a plan. I couldn't stay in the tent indefinitely, and I couldn't just run into the darkness either. I decided my best option was to make myself appear larger and more threatening without leaving the relative safety of my tent. I grabbed a sturdy flashlight and shook it, making bright beams sweep across the clearing, and shouted loudly, hoping the sound would warn off any animal. I waited, tense, every sense on high alert. The forest remained silent for what felt like an eternity, and then slowly, the sounds of movement retreated into the distance. My body relaxed slightly, but I stayed awake, alert, and listening for the rest of the night. I didn't sleep much, waking repeatedly to any noise. When the first light of dawn broke through the trees, I felt a mix of relief and exhaustion. The morning was cool and calm, and the forest looked completely normal in the daylight. I packed up my camp, still cautious but encouraged by the clear, quiet morning. I decided to shorten my planned hike, staying closer to the trail in case I needed to retreat quickly. The adrenaline from the previous night lingered, making every sound, the rustle of leaves, the snap of twigs under my own feet, startling. But as the hours passed, I realized that the forest was normal, and my anxiety was mostly a response to fear and isolation. By mid-afternoon, I had completed a shorter loop along the trail, discovering a small waterfall and a hidden grove of wildflowers. The beauty of the area helped ease my tension. I stayed aware of my surroundings, noting animal tracks and broken branches, but nothing unusual happened. As the sun began to lower in the sky, I started heading back toward my car. The hike down the mountain was easier, gravity aiding my descent, though I remained cautious on the steeper sections. I thought about the events of the previous night and realized that the noise I had heard was probably a large animal, maybe a bear or a wild boar, moving through the underbrush. The situation had been tense and frightening, but I had survived because I stayed calm, assessed my options, and used the resources I had. I reached my car in the late afternoon, exhausted but relieved. The forest behind me looked peaceful and untouched, the shadows of the tall trees stretching long in the fading sunlight. I carefully loaded my gear and took one last look at the trailhead before starting the drive back down the mountain. The journey home was quiet, and I felt a mixture of satisfaction and lingering adrenaline. I had faced the fear and uncertainty of being alone in the wilderness at night and emerged safely. The experience left me with a deep respect for nature, a renewed awareness of the need for preparation and caution, and a sense of accomplishment for having navigated a difficult situation on my own. Back at home, I unpacked my gear and cleaned everything carefully. I felt a strange sense of gratitude for the experience, for the beauty of the forest, and even for the fear I had faced. It reminded me that nature is both breathtaking and unpredictable, and that even in moments of real danger, careful thought, calmness, and preparedness can carry you through. I knew that I would return to the mountains one day, but I would never forget the lessons learned during that tense, unforgettable night.